So, welcome, and I hope wherever you are is comfortable. Tonight we're going underground, deep underground, under the misty mountains in the central part of Middle-earth, into a place that carried several names over the course of several thousand years. You probably know it as Moria, which is the name most people come away with from The Lord of the Rings. But Moria is actually a late name and not a friendly one. It's a Sindarin word meaning something like black chasm or black pit, and it was given to the place by the elves of Lorien in a period when the city had gone dark and terrible things were living in it. For most of its history, the place was called Khazad-dûm, which translates roughly as Dwarves' Mansion in the dwarven tongue of Khazad-dûm, and for most of its existence, that name was accurate. It was the greatest mansion of the greatest dwarven people, full of lamplight and stone craft, and the particular kind of deep quiet that only underground places have. What draws me back to Khazad-dûm whenever I sit down to think about Tolkien's world is the sheer span of it. This place is present, in one form or another, for essentially the entire history of Middle-earth. It's there before the First Age properly begins. It's still there when the Fellowship passes through its darkened halls in the Third Age. And it's there in the Fourth Age too, at the very end of Tolkien's written mythology, when it's finally reclaimed and the hammers start ringing again. Most places in Middle-earth have a golden period and then either vanish or fade into irrelevance. Khazad-dûm just keeps going. I find that genuinely remarkable. There's also something I enjoy about doing a deep history of a single location rather than a broad overview of an age or a people. Broad overviews are useful, but they can't quite do justice to what makes Tolkien's world feel the way it does, which is the sense of depth beneath every surface. When Frodo and the Fellowship walk through Moria, they're not walking through a ruined dungeon. They're walking through the ruins of a city that was already ancient before the sun and moon existed. Every detail in those chapters means something, and the meaning lives in what came before. That's what tonight is about, the before and the after, and everything in between. We're going through all of it, from the moment before the dwarves existed at all, to the last thing Tolkien has to say about the mountain. That takes us through the creation of the dwarven people, the founding of the city, its golden centuries, its catastrophic fall, several failed and one very nearly successful attempt at reclamation, the passage of the Fellowship of the Ring, a battle between two ancient spirits on a mountaintop, and eventually a quiet return at the end of history. The main sources tonight are the Silmarillion, Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, which is where most dwarven history actually lives, tucked away at the back of the book, where not enough people read it. The relevant chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring itself, and various notes and essays collected in Unfinished Tales and the Peoples of Middle-earth. There's no rush. Each section is self-contained enough that it doesn't really matter where you drift off. The stone will still be there when you come back. One thing I always find when I sit down with this particular corner of the Legendarium is that the appendices of The Lord of the Rings are somehow even more melancholy than the main text. The main text is moving in the way that stories with characters you've come to love are always moving. But the appendices are melancholy in a different register. They give you chronologies and genealogies and brief paragraphs about things that happened over centuries, and the compression of it creates its own kind of feeling. A whole kingdom rises and falls in 2 sentences. A family line continues for 800 years and then ends in a footnote. Reading them at night, which is apparently when a lot of people do read them, there's a quality of sitting with something very old and knowing you're only seeing the surface. The history of Khazad-dûm is mostly in those appendices, and I think it benefits from being slowed down and spread out and given a bit of room to breathe. Right, let's start at the very beginning, before the city, before the dwarves, before, in some sense, the world as it's normally described. To understand where Khazad-dûm comes from, you have to understand where the dwarves come from, and that story begins with a Vala called Ule. The Vala are, in Tolkien's cosmology, the great powers who descended into the world to help shape and govern it. They're sometimes compared to gods, though Tolkien was careful to distinguish them from Eru Ilúvatar, the actual creator, who exists at a different level of being entirely. The Valar are more like very powerful stewards. They have domains. Manwe governs the air, Ulmo is the master of water, Yavanna tends growing things, and Aula, the one we're interested in right now, is the craftsman of the Valar. His particular love is for substances, for the materials of the world, for stone and metal, and the things that can be made from them. He shaped the bones of the earth, in a sense. He made the mountains themselves. And Auli was impatient. The children of Ilúvatar, the elves and men, had not yet awakened. The world was young, Morgoth was causing trouble in the north, and the Valar were occupied. But Aula wanted beings he could teach his crafts to. He wanted students who would appreciate the substances of the earth, who would delight in making things. So without asking permission, and without quite having the ability to do it properly, he made the 7 fathers of the dwarves. He made them in secret, in a hall under the mountains of Middle-earth. He made them strong and resistant, because the world was full of Morgoth's creatures, and he wanted them to be able to endure. He fashioned them short and sturdy, stone-hard, with tremendous physical resilience. And then he tried to teach them to speak, in a language he'd invented for them, Khazad-dûm, the dwarven tongue, a secret and difficult language that the dwarves would keep to themselves throughout all the ages of the world. The problem was that Aule, despite all his power, didn't possess what Tolkien calls the flame imperishable. He couldn't create true life. The 7 fathers moved and spoke when Aule was actively thinking about them, but the moment his attention was elsewhere, they went still. They weren't really alive. They were extraordinary constructions, but they were constructions. Ilúvatar noticed, and he always notices, and confronted Aule about it. And Aule's response is, I think, one of the more genuinely touching moments in all of the Silmarillion. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't try to justify himself. He simply says that he was impatient, that he wanted to teach, that he meant no challenge to Ilúvatar's authority. And then, in genuine repentance, he picks up a great hammer and prepares to unmake what he's made. And that's the moment the 7 fathers cry out. They shrink back from the hammer and beg for mercy, because Ilúvatar had given them true life at the very moment of Aule's repentance. It's a rather beautiful theological move. Aule's willingness to destroy his creations, born out of genuine humility rather than coerced submission, is what causes them to actually come alive. Ilúvatar adopts them, incorporates them into his plan for the world. But he has conditions. The dwarves must sleep until after the elves have awakened, because the elves were always intended to be the firstborn. Aule agrees and lays the 7 fathers into stone chambers deep underground, where they wait in silence for an age. The dwarves call themselves the Khazad, and they call Aule by the name Mahal, meaning maker. Their relationship with him is interesting and a little bittersweet. They were made out of love and impatience, by someone who wanted to teach but wasn't supposed to create, and they came to genuine life only when he was prepared to lose them. There's a melancholy to that origin that carries through into how dwarves are portrayed throughout the mythology. They're stubborn and resilient, they love craft and stone and the deep places of the earth, but there's also something isolated about them, something set apart. Their afterlife beliefs reflect this actually. The dwarves believed that Mahal gathers them to halls set apart in Mandos when they die, separate from the halls of the elves, and that at the end of days they'll work alongside Aule to help remake Arda after the last battle. The elves, for their part, had a rather different theory. They thought dwarves simply returned to stone when they died, because that's what they were made of. The dwarves found this view rather insulting, which is fair enough. Needs review. Of the 7 fathers, only one has a name we know, Du-O-Rin. He was the eldest, the first and greatest, and he was laid to sleep alone. The other 6 were laid in pairs with their wives. Du-O-Rin had none. The later dwarven tradition would say that his line never failed, and he had heirs throughout the ages, so the solitude was ultimately overcome. But he started alone, in a stone chamber under a mountain, waiting for the world to be ready for him. A small note before we move on. Tolkien borrowed the dwarven names almost directly from the old Norse Völuspá, one of the great poems of Norse mythology. Dwalin, Bifur, Bofur, Bomber, Dori, Nori, Ori, Thorin. These are all names that appear in a list of dwarves in that poem. Du-O-Rin appears there too, so Tolkien's dwarves reach back into actual medieval Norse tradition, and Khazad-dûm, for all its invented detail, is partly the descendant of a much older imagining of what underground places made by dwarfish beings might look like. Something else worth noting before we leave the creation story. Khazad-dûm, the dwarven language Aule invented for them, became one of the most distinctive cultural markers of the dwarven people across all the ages. Unlike Sindarin or Quenya, which the elves spoke freely with others, and which spread widely through Middle-earth, Khazad-dûm was kept strictly private. The dwarves didn't teach it to outsiders. They didn't use it in public when other peoples were present. Their true names, given to them at birth, were in Khazad-dûm and were never told to anyone outside the community. To the outside world, dwarves had Mannish or Elvish names, the Thorins and Balins and Gimlis that we know from the books, but those were essentially adopted names for external use. Their actual names were held within the people alone. This linguistic secrecy is connected to the creation story in a way I find quietly interesting. Aule made the dwarves in secret. He gave them a language in secret. They came alive in a chamber underground, away from everyone. And even after they became a people, moving through the world, they kept a core of themselves private, in a way the other peoples didn't. The creation happened in hiding, and something of that remained in how they held themselves. Khazad-dûm, the city they built, is the same, deep inside a mountain. Not hidden exactly, but not on display either. You have to go a long way in before you see what it really is, right? So the 7 fathers sleep. The elves awaken somewhere in the east of Middle-earth, at a place called Cuiviénen. And sometime after that, the 7 fathers are roused. Du-O-Rin wakes at a mountain called Gundabad in the northern Misty Mountains, and then he starts walking. Mount Gundabad is in the far north of the Misty Mountains, where the range meets the grey mountains and the world gets cold and difficult. It's later going to become an orc stronghold, which is one of those geographical details in Tolkien that carries a particular kind of insult. A place sacred to the dwarves, occupied by their enemies. But in the early days, before all of that, Du-Rin simply wakes up there, alone, in the Years of the Trees. The Years of the Trees are the period before the sun and moon existed. The world is lit by the 2 trees of Valich Nor, Telperion and Laurelin, silver and gold, whose light reaches Middle-earth only distantly, in a kind of ambient twilight. The stars are present and visible, because Varda had made them before the trees. It's a strange, dim, beautiful era in the mythology, and Du-Rin waking up in the middle of it must have been a particular experience. He was the first dwarf. He had no one to explain things to him, no precedent, no tradition yet. He simply woke up in a stone chamber, under a mountain, with a language already in his head, and the knowledge of how to make things, and he walked out into a world that was very quiet. He walked south along the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. This is the range that runs roughly north to south through the centre of Middle-earth, and the eastern side, in later ages, faces toward Rhovanion, toward the Gladden Fields, and eventually Mirkwood. In Du-Rin's time, there would have been none of those place names, just mountains to the west and open land to the east, under the soft starlit twilight of the pre-dawn world. He eventually arrived at a valley called Azanul-Bisar in the Dwarven tongue. In later texts, it becomes the Dimril Dale. It's a valley at the foot of 3 peaks, Zirac Sigil, which men would later call the Silvertine or Celeb Dil, Barazin Bar, which becomes Cu Ra Thras, or the Red Horn in the Third Age, and Bundushathur, known to men as Cloudy Head or Fanweed Hole. 3 significant mountains looming over a valley with a lake at its feet. I always find the layering of names in Tolkien slightly vertiginous, in the best way. The same stone peaks carrying entirely different names depending on who's looking at them and what they care about, each name accurate in its own tradition. The lake is Kheled-Zoram. The dwarves call it the Mirror, and it deserves a proper moment of attention because it becomes one of the most recurring images in the whole of Khazad-dûm's history. Tolkien describes it as very still, dark and surrounded by the reflections of the mountains. Durin looked into it, and what he saw wasn't quite his own reflection. He saw a crown of 7 stars above his head, even though those stars weren't visible in the sky at that moment. He took this as a sign, which seems like a reasonable response, honestly. He went into the caves above the lake and began to build. This is Khazad-dûm. It starts in the natural caves above Kheled-Zoram on the eastern face of the Misty Mountains, and it grows from there. In later ages, Durin's descendants would erect a stone monolith called Durin's Stone near the lake, marking the spot where he first looked in and saw the crown of stars. By the time of the Fellowship, thousands of years later, the stone was so old and weather-worn that the inscription on it couldn't be read, but it was still standing. Now, the naming of the place is worth a moment, because Tolkien gives it several names in several languages and they each say something different about the place. Khazad-dûm in Khazad-dûl, the Dwarven language, the Dwarves' Mansion. Hadhodrond in Sindarin, the Elvish tongue most common in the Third Age. Furanargian in Old Westron, from roots meaning something like dwarf delving, an archaic form that became, in more recognisable English, Dwaro-delf. And then later, Emor-e-a, the Black Pit or the Black Chasm in Sindarin, a name the dwarves deeply resented. Different peoples name the same place from their own perspective, in their own language, and the names reflect what the place means to them. The dwarves call it the Mansion. The elves, after the fall, call it the Black Pit. That difference says quite a lot about what happened between those 2 namings. Even at this early stage, Khazad-dûm was famous well beyond its immediate neighbourhood. The elves of Beleriand, far to the northwest, had heard of it from the dwarves of the Blue Mountains and knew it as a great wonder, even though few had ever visited. For a city that hadn't done any particularly notable political thing at this point, just existing and growing, to be known that far away suggests that the quality and scale of what Dio Rin was building was evident from early on. One last thing before we look at the architecture. Mount Gundabad, where Dio Rin woke, remained a sacred site for the dwarves throughout the ages. It was their ancestral home, the place where the eldest father was laid to sleep. When it was taken by orcs in the Second Age, that loss was felt as more than a military setback. There's something in the dwarven character throughout the mythology that cares very much about continuity with the past, about places that carry memory. Khazad-dûm becomes the most important of those places, but Gundabad is where it all starts. Let's spend some time in the city itself because Tolkien gives us more detail about the physical structure of Khazad-dûm than you might expect, scattered across various texts, and it's possible to piece together a reasonably clear picture of the place. The main entrance on the eastern side is what's called the East Gate, or sometimes the Great Gates. These open onto the Dimril Dale with the Mirror just below. Coming in through the East Gate, you enter the first hall, which is the first major chamber inside the mountain. From there, a wide passage and a series of stairs lead to the bridge of Khazad-dûm. The bridge deserves a proper description. It's a narrow walkway, roughly 50 feet long, crossing a chasm that the texts suggest is of vertiginous depth. It's clearly designed as a defensive structure. If an invading army somehow managed to break through the gates and everything beyond, they would then have to cross this bridge single file, which makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to defenders on the far side. It's elegant, in a brutal sort of way. Good defensive engineering usually is. The bridge leads to the second hall, and from there the rest of the city opens up, both upward and downward. There are 7 levels above the base level of the east gate, and 7 deeps below it. The upper levels have windows and light shafts cut through the rock to bring in natural daylight, so the higher you go, the more naturally lit it is. Below the level of the east gate, the deeps grow darker and more mine-like as they descend. The upper and middle levels are the inhabited city. The lower deeps are progressively more extraction territory. The whole eastern portion of Khazad-dûm is the city proper. The chambers and passages and great pillared halls, with their walls described as polished, smooth and black as glass. The spaces where the dwarves lived and worked for thousands of years. The western portion gradually becomes more industrial, the mining areas extending toward the far side of the mountain. All of this was illuminated in the city's working days by what Tolkien calls shining lamps of crystal. I've always found this detail particularly evocative. The dwarves didn't just live in a natural cave system with torches stuck to the walls. They manufactured their own lighting, and it was apparently beautiful enough to be mentioned specifically as one of the wonders of the place. A city lit by crystal lamps, polished walls reflecting the light. Deep underground, in a mountain, there's a particular kind of grandeur to that image, at once intimate and enormous. Then there's the endless stair. This is one of the most extraordinary pieces of infrastructure in the whole city, a staircase that runs from the very foundations of the mountain far below the deeps, all the way up to the summit of Eagle. At the top of the stair is Dio Orin's Tower, a building at the peak of the Silvertine that could only be reached by climbing the endless stair. The idea of a staircase connecting the deepest basement of a city to the top of a mountain is, when you think about it for a moment, rather staggering. And the stair features in the later history of the place in a significant way. A specific room worth mentioning early, because it appears several times in tonight's history, the Chamber of Mazabul. It's located on the eastern edge of the 7th level, right at the upper end of the inhabited area. Mazabul means records in Khuzdul, and that's what it was, the Chamber of Records where important documents of the city were kept. In later history, it becomes the throne room of Balin when he attempts to recolonize the city, and later still, it's where Ori writes the last pages of his chronicle. And it's where the Fellowship fights off an orc attack, while Gandalf holds a door. We'll spend proper time there later. For now, just register it. 7th level, eastern end, a room that was once used for keeping records. One thing worth saying about Dwarven architecture more broadly, because it's relevant to understanding the whole feel of Khazad-dûm. Dwarves build downward and inward, rather than upward and outward. Their ideal isn't the tower or the soaring arch above open ground. It's the hall, the chamber, the passage, the sense of being enclosed and held rather than exposed to the sky. There's something about the quality of dwarven spaces that feels genuinely different from elven or human building, and Tolkien is consistent about this. The greatest achievement of the greatest dwarven city is that it goes very, very deep. The lamps and the polished walls are beautiful, but the beauty serves the depth rather than the height. There's a texture difference between the upper levels and the lower ones that's worth noting, because it matters for how you imagine the inhabited city versus the mine. The upper levels, the first several above the East Gate level, are where people actually lived. These would have had the polished walls, the crystal lamps, the carved columns. The scale is enormous, but it's finished scale, craft scale, the kind of enormity that feels intentional. As you descend into the deeps, the finishing gradually falls away, and you're in working spaces rather than living spaces. Rougher walls, functional passages, the noise and grime of extraction. Two entirely different kinds of underground, existing at different elevations of the same mountain. The city sits on top of its industry, quite literally. What remains impossible to fully imagine, I think, is what the city actually sounded like when it was full. The echo properties of stone halls at this scale, with thousands of people moving through them, the particular resonance of hammers on metal in enclosed spaces, the way voices would carry and multiply. The Fellowship's passage through the dead city is explicitly noted as very quiet, with only their footsteps echoing, and Tolkien emphasises the weight of that silence against what the sounds would once have been. It's one of those contrasts in the text that works entirely through implication. One last thing about the physical structure. The well that Pippin accidentally disturbs when the Fellowship passes through. He knocks a stone into it, and a bone, and they fall for what seems like a very long time before a small distant plink is heard. Then from somewhere far below, a rhythmic tapping begins. Tolkien doesn't give measurements of the depth, he doesn't need to. The sound of the stone falling is enough. The mine areas of the city, in the western portion and in the lower deeps, also deserve a brief mention, because they're where most of the story's weight eventually accumulates. They're less finished than the city spaces, more rough-hewn, shaped by extraction rather than by craft. The further west and the further down you go, the more Khazad-dûm starts to feel less like a city and more like a mine. And it's in those mine areas, in the deepest and least charted places, that the most significant thing in this history is eventually found. Duo-Rinai, who founded Khazad-dûm, is known as the Deathless, and the concept of Duo-Rin, of what he is and what he represents to his people, runs through the entire history of the city like a thread. He wasn't actually immortal. That's worth clarifying because the name suggests otherwise. Durin the Deathless lived for an extraordinary length of time, even by dwarven standards, but he died before the end of the First Age. What made him the Deathless wasn't immortality in the elven sense. It was the belief, held firmly by his people through all the ages that followed, that he would return. The dwarven tradition around Duo-Rin's reincarnation is a little unusual, even within Tolkien's mythology. It's not quite reincarnation in the conventional sense. The belief as recorded in the appendices is that Duo-Rin's spirit returned to his original body rather than being born into a new one, that his body was somehow preserved, and that his spirit came back to inhabit it at intervals. And throughout the history of Khazad-dûm and Durin's folk, there are 5 heirs born into his line who so closely resembled him in appearance, character, and temperament that they were given the name Durin and believed by the dwarves to be him returned. Durin the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. A 7th and final Durin comes at the very end of the story in the 4th Age. We'll get to him. Tolkien is careful to hedge this a little. He notes that these beliefs may simply be stories the dwarves tell about their own ancestry, that the resemblances might be family resemblance, rather than supernatural return. Fair enough, but even as a matter of cultural memory rather than literal fact, the idea is interesting, that the founder of the greatest dwarven city returns to it again and again, throughout its history, in bodies that carry his name and his character. There's a kind of defiance in it. The mountain endures, the founder returns. Durin's tomb is in Khazad-dûm. His descendants built it for him after he died, and it was one of the most revered sites in the dwarven world. The exact location isn't specified in the texts, but given its reverence, it was presumably somewhere in the older, upper levels of the city. The era of Durin the Deathless is later remembered as Durin's Day, which is also the name applied to the Dwarven New Year, the day when the last moon of autumn and the sun are both visible in the sky at the same time. That's a detail from The Hobbit. Thorin's map has a note about Durin's Day, but the name refers back to this founding period. to the time when the city was young and the first king was alive, and the world was quieter. During his reign, the great architectural works are completed: the bridge, the second hall, the endless stair, Durin's tower. The city grows continuously, becoming what Tolkien calls the greatest of all the mansions of the dwarves. And this is already true before the elves of Beleriand have returned to Middle-earth. Khazad-dûm is ancient in a way that puts even the long elvish tradition in perspective. I want to dwell briefly on the Norse connection, because I think it adds something to the atmosphere of the whole thing. Tolkien built his dwarves on a foundation of Old Norse tradition: the names, the associations with underground craft, the love of precious metals, the particular stubbornness. In the Norse tradition, dwarves are subterranean craftsmen, makers of legendary things associated with the deep places. Tolkien took that and expanded it enormously, gave it history and language and geography. But the deep structure is there. There's something in that Norse inheritance that gives dwarves a particular weight in the mythology. They're not romantic the way elves are. They're not young and endlessly adaptable the way men are. They're old and stubborn and very good at very specific things. And their greatest city is a hole in a mountain that they dug themselves over thousands of years. And somehow, in Tolkien's hands, that becomes genuinely magnificent. The city's fame by the time of the later First Age extends far beyond the misty mountains. The elves of Beleriand know of it. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains speak of it with reverence. It is already the standard against which all other dwarven works are measured. The First Age is when everything burns, more or less. Morgoth has Angband and Thangorodrim in the far north, and the wars he wages against the elves of Beleriand are catastrophic. Balrogs and dragons and orc armies descending on one elven kingdom after another. A slow attrition that takes centuries and destroys nearly everything. Khazad-dûm during all of this is largely uninvolved. This is genuinely interesting and worth sitting with for a moment. The city is certainly not ignorant of what's happening in Beleriand. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm are in contact with the wider world. They know about the wars. They trade with the dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains, who are very much part of the conflict. But Khazad-dûm itself, in the misty mountains east of Beleriand, stays out of the fighting. Tolkien's brief explanation is that Khazad-dûm played no part in the wars of Beleriand, partly because Morgoth was occupied enough with the elves and didn't have the spare capacity to push his forces eastward into the misty mountains, where they would have encountered serious dwarven resistance in terrain that heavily favoured the dwarves. When Morgoth needed all his strength elsewhere is the phrase Tolkien uses. So the relative peace of Khazad-dûm during the First Age is partly strategic fortune. The dwarves who are very much involved in the wars are those from Belegost and Nogrod. The dwarves of Belegost in particular are remarkable fighters. They wear great masks and helms in battle, which gives them some resistance to the effects of dragonfire, and they were instrumental in checking Glaurung, the first dragon, during the catastrophic battle of Unnumbered Tears. The dwarves of Belegost also invented the art of making coats of linked rings, dwarven mail, which is the craft tradition that eventually produces the Emith Rill coat that saves Frodo's life. So even if Khazad-dûm isn't directly engaged in the First Age wars, the broader dwarven world is contributing crucially to them. The relationship between dwarves and elves during this period is complicated. There's genuine friendship and trade. The dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod help carve Menegroth. The 1,000 caves of Doriath for the elf lord Thingol, but there are also serious conflicts, the most severe being the sack of Menegroth, when dwarves of Nogrod kill Thingol and steal the necklace of the dwarves, and are then ambushed and largely destroyed on their way home. This event casts a long shadow over elf-dwarf relations that echoes into the Third Age. Legolas and Gimli's friendship in The Lord of the Rings is notably unusual, precisely because genuine warmth between the two peoples is so uncommon. Meanwhile, in Khazad-dûm, the lamps are burning and the hammers are ringing. The mithril discovery isn't precisely dated in the texts, but by the Second Age, it's already established as the defining feature of the city's wealth. So it was found at some point during the First Age, or possibly even earlier. The circumstances of finding it, the first miner to break through into a vein of something fundamentally unlike any other metal, aren't recorded. It seems like it would have been a memorable moment. What daily life in Khazad-dûm was like during the First Age, the actual texture of it, is almost entirely undocumented. We know the city was growing. We know it was accumulating wealth. We know it had trade contacts with the wider world. But the individual stories, the politics, the internal history of those centuries, it's lost. The dwarves kept records. Tolkien just didn't write them. I find there's something rather peaceful about that gap, actually. The First Age in Beleriand is full of terrible battles and burning cities and elf princes dying in memorable ways. And over in the Misty Mountains, the dwarves are just building things and mining and being themselves. A steady flame in a world full of disasters. What we can say about the trade connections is that the dwarves of Khazad-dûm were exporting stone goods and worked metal eastward and westward, and importing things from the elves that they couldn't easily make themselves. Certain dyes, particular plant materials, things that came from the living world above ground. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains were the intermediaries for most of the westward trade, which is one reason they were more directly involved in the First Age wars than Khazad-dûm was. They were closer to Beleriand. They had established relationships with the elven kingdoms there, and their interests and fates were more intertwined. There's also the question of what Khazad-dûm knew about the wars. They would have known, in broad terms. Refugees would have passed through the region. News travels, even in the First Age, and the dwarves of the Blue Mountains who survived the various catastrophes of Beleriand would have brought accounts of what was happening westward. So the dwarves underground in the Misty Mountains were not ignorant of the scale of what Morgoth was doing. They were simply not in its direct path, and they knew better than to step into a path they didn't have to. The War of Wrath ends the First Age. The Valar, who have been relatively uninvolved while Morgoth wages war across Beleriand, finally bring their full force to bear. Morgoth is defeated, chained, and cast out of the world entirely. But the cost of that victory is the destruction of the continent where the wars were fought. Beleriand itself is broken, and most of it floods, sinking beneath the Western Sea. The Blue Mountains survive more or less, but the great dwarven cities built in them, Belegost and Nogrod, are ruined. And so, starting around the year 40 of the Second Age, most of the surviving dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod make the long journey east to Khazad-dûm. There's nowhere else to go. The city in the Misty Mountains is the one major dwarven realm still intact. This migration is one of the most consequential events in Khazad-dûm's history, and it's easy to underestimate because it's not dramatic. No one was conquered. No one invaded. It's simply a large movement of people and knowledge heading toward the one place that survived. But the effects are profound. Khazad-dûm gains population, a significant amount of it. But more importantly than sheer numbers, it gains expertise. The dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod had their own craft traditions, their own smithing techniques, their own particular knowledge. They brought centuries of experience working alongside elves, trading in rare materials, solving problems that the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm had never needed to face. They brought all of that with them. The result is that Khazad-dûm reaches what Tolkien describes as the very pinnacle of its history in this period. The combination of the Longbeards' deep knowledge of the mountain and the newcomers' extraordinary craftsmanship produces something genuinely without equal. The mining expansion westward through the Misty Mountains is completed at this time, so that for the first time a traveller can pass underground through the entire width of the mountain range, from east to west, entirely within the halls of Khazad-dûm. This is also the period when mithril is being mined in its greatest quantities, And it's worth spending a moment on what mithril actually is, because it's so central to the city's story. It's the only fictional metal Tolkien invented. Everything else in his world uses real-world metals, or at least their names. Mithril is unique, silver white, lighter than any common metal, yet harder than tempered steel, permanently resistant to tarnish, malleable enough to work like copper, yet nothing made from it bends or breaks, as softer metals do. The elves learned to make from it an alloy called ithildin, a material visible only by starlight and moonlight, which comes up very soon in the history. And at the height of Khazad-dûm's mining operations, mithril was worth 10 times its weight in gold. That valuation becomes essentially meaningless eventually, because the supply is cut off entirely, and the metal becomes priceless. A coat of mithril rings, which Bilbo Baggins gives to Frodo, is described in the Third Age as worth more than the entire Shire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in the early Second Age, the city is at its absolute peak. The greatest craftsmen of the dwarven world are all in one place, working with the rarest metal in Middle-earth. The western extension of the city, which will become so important shortly, is complete. The stage is set for the most remarkable friendship in Second Age history. The cultural dimension of the migration is worth a moment of attention too, because it goes beyond craft technique. The dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod had been living alongside elves for centuries, in ways that the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm had not. They'd worked for Thingol, they'd fought in elvish wars, they understood elvish languages in a way that more isolated dwarves might not. When they arrived at Khazad-dûm, they brought that accumulated experience of the wider world with them, and it's probably no coincidence that the city's relationship with Ehreg-on, which develops a few centuries later, is as warm and productive as it is. A Khazad-dûm that had only its own tradition might have been more closed to the friendship. A Khazad-dûm that now included people who had spent centuries living near elves was probably more prepared for it. Around the year 700 of the Second Age, a group of Noldor elves establishes a realm called Ehreg-i, on just to the west of the Misty Mountains. Ehreg-i-on means Land of Holly in Sindarin. Later ages will know the region as Hollin. Its lord is Celebi-rim-bor, and he's worth a proper introduction. Celebi-rim-bor is the grandson of Feanor, which tells you something important about him. Feanor made the Silmarils, the 3 greatest jewels in the history of the world, and the entire First Age is essentially the catastrophic fallout from that act of creation. Celebi-rim-bor inherited Feanor's particular obsession with making things. He's a craftsman first, a king second, and that changes everything about how he relates to his neighbours. Because craftsmen can talk to each other. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Ehreg-i find common ground in the love of making things, and the friendship that develops between the two peoples is genuinely unusual in the mythology. Elves and dwarves are typically at arm's length at best. The history between them is complicated, but in the Second Age, in this particular place and time, something different happens. Galadriel is connected to this story too. The sources suggest she may have passed through Khazad-dûm during this period, leading some of her people eastward to what will become Lothlorien. The Lady of the Golden Wood was once a guest in the great halls of the city that her future companions will later fight their way through. I find that detail quietly pleasing. The trade between Khazad-dûm and Ehreg-i is rich for both sides, and particularly significant because the dwarves have mithril, and the elves have learned to work it in ways the dwarves haven't fully explored. One of those ways is ithildin, the alloy visible only by starlight and moonlight, and this discovery is about to be put to rather beautiful use. The physical fruit of the Khazad-dûm and Ehreg-i friendship is the west gate of the city, the Doors of Durin. Built sometime between SA 750 and SA 1500, the texts are vague about the exact date. It's the western entrance to Khazad-dûm, on the cliffs of Moria, accessible from the Ehreg Eon side, and it was built by two craftsmen working together, Navi the dwarf and Lebi Rim Bor the elf. Navi is not a character who appears much in the texts. He's known almost entirely through this single act of creation, but the doors he made are extraordinary. When closed, they couldn't be seen as doors at all. They appeared as the solid face of the cliff, indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. Navi made them with such precision that they were functionally invisible. Caleb Rim Bor then inlaid the design and inscription in Itildin. The symbols on the doors are the hammer and anvil of Dorin, the crown and 7 stars referencing the crown Dorin saw reflected in the Mirrormere, 2 intertwined trees for the High Elves, and the Star of Feanor, Caleb Rim Bor's own house emblem. There are also smaller marks, C for Caleb Rim Bor, N for Navi, D for Durin, and then the inscription, arching across the top of the doors, which Tolkien gives us in full, Ennin Durin Aranmor, I, U, Peidomelanamino, Im Narvi Han Echant, Cehlebi Rim, Bor O Ehregi O Taitante Tivhin, which translates to, the doors of Durin, Lord of Mor Ia, speak, friend, and enter. I, Navi, made them. Caleb Rimbor of Ehreg Eon drew these signs. The speak, friend, and enter is, as Gandalf eventually works out, in the Third Age, not a demand for a complex password. It's an instruction. Say the Elvish word for friend, and the doors open. The word is melon. That's it. Gandalf spends a while trying elaborate combinations before Frodo suggests the obvious solution, and there's a particular satisfaction in watching Gandalf be slightly sheepish about it. The reason the doors worked this simply is because when they were made, there was no need for complicated security. The doors were often just open. This was a time of genuine peace and friendship between the peoples on either side, and the doors were as much a symbol of that openness as they were an entrance. The inscription isn't asking for a password, it's extending an invitation. While we're in this period, Caleb Rim Bor gives Durin the third one of the 7 dwarven rings of power, and he gives it directly, without Sauron's involvement. These are not the corrupted rings. They were made with elvish craft and dwarven goodwill, and they work rather differently on dwarves than SOW expected. They intensify the dwarven love of gold and hoarding, making already acquisitive people even more so, but they can't turn dwarves into wraiths. Dwarves, as Tolkien noted, are made of harder stuff. The rings amplify their greed without enslaving their will. That's a meaningful distinction, and it matters for what happens to the rings later. This period, the friendship with Ehreg Eon, the building of the doors, the trade in mithril, represents something genuinely rare in the mythology. It doesn't last, but while it does, it's rather lovely. I want to be specific about what the dwarves were getting out of the relationship, because it's easy to focus on mithril as the obvious thing they were offering and overlook what came back. The Noldor elves of Ehreg Eon were in many respects the most technically sophisticated craftspeople in Middle-earth's history, outside of the Valar themselves. They had the inherited tradition of Feanor and centuries of working in Beleriand alongside the elvish craftsmen of the First Age. They brought knowledge of gemcraft, of setting stones in metal, of techniques for working alloys that the dwarves hadn't developed. They also brought written lore in elvish scripts, and it was through this contact that the dwarven craftsmen of Khazad-dûm learned to use the Feanorian letters, the Tengwar script, for certain formal inscriptions. The Book of Mazabul, which Ori writes in his last days in the Chamber of Records, uses both Tengwar and the dwarven runes called Cirth, a mixture that speaks directly to this period of cultural exchange. Celebi Rim Bor, for his part, got access to mithril in quantities he couldn't have obtained any other way, and he got the dwarven expertise in working the deep stone, which informed his understanding of how to build things to last. The doors of Rin themselves, the way they're set into the cliff face, the precision of the stonework, is a product of that combined knowledge. Neither the elf nor the dwarf could have made them alone. Into the prosperity of the mid-Second Age comes a stranger. He calls himself Aen Utar, the Lord of Gifts, and he arrives in Aereg-E-on with knowledge and flattery, and an offer to help the craftsmen improve their work. He claims to be an emissary from the Vala, which is not true, but he's persuasive about it. Gu-la-Driel doesn't trust him. Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, doesn't trust him. Their warnings are not heeded in Aereg-E-on, because Caleb Rimbor wants to learn what Aen Utar knows. And Aen Utar knows quite a lot. The two of them work together on the Rings of Power, rings given to men and dwarves, with 3 elvish rings that Caleb Bor makes independently and keeps secret from Sow-Ron. Then in SA 1600, Sow-Ron forges the One Ring in Orod Ruin. The purpose of the One Ring is to bind all the other rings' wearers to his will. The moment he puts it on, Caleb Rimbor feels it. He understands, in that instant, the nature of the deception. He hides the 3 elvish rings and breaks with Sow-Ron. What follows is swift and devastating. Sow-Ron gathers an army and attacks Aereg-E-on in SA 1697. The kingdom is overrun. Caleb Rimbor is killed. He was captured, tortured for information about the locations of the rings, and then killed, his body reportedly used as a banner by Sow-Ron's forces, which is a grim end for someone who was fundamentally just a craftsman trying to make beautiful things. He was, in some ways, the most consequential elf who ever lived, for both good and terrible reasons. Elrond, commanding part of the surviving elvish force, retreats north and is pursued. This is where Khazad-dûm enters the story directly. The dwarves come out of their mountain and attack Sow-Ron's army from the rear, providing Elrond's force a chance to escape. It's one of the few moments in the Second Age where the city is directly engaged in the large-scale history of Middle-earth, and it's worth saying that they do it as an act of solidarity rather than self-interest. Aereg-E-on is not their city, but the elves there were their friends, and Sow-Ron had destroyed that friendship. Sow-Ron, naturally, turns his full attention on the dwarves in response, and the dwarves, being realistic about what they're dealing with, retreat into the mountain and close the doors of Rin behind them. From SA 1697, those doors would not be opened from the outside again until the Fellowship enters more than 1,300 years later. The Western Gate, built as a symbol of friendship and open exchange, becomes a sealed barrier between two peoples who are becoming strangers. The friendship between Khazad-dûm and the elves doesn't end in hostility exactly. There's no formal rupture. It's more that the friendship fades through separation. Aereg-E-on is gone. The elves who survive go to Rivendell or to Lothlorien. The dwarves are inside the mountain with the doors shut. Trade stops, contact stops. The warmth that had built up over centuries gradually cools, as warmth does when the source of it is removed. The orcs take advantage of this upheaval. During and after the war, they re-invade the Misty Mountains and seize Mount Gundabad, the site where Durin the Deathless had slept, the ancestral holy place of Durin's folk. The orcs don't occupy it because it's particularly defensible. They occupy it because they know what it means to the dwarves. Khazad-dûm survives this period intact. The doors hold. Sow-Ron has other concerns. The last alliance of elves and men is gathering as the age draws toward its end, and his attention is needed elsewhere. The mountain stands isolated but unbreached. The crystal lamps inside are still lit. The hammers are still ringing. But the city has changed. It was, for a while, part of something larger, a network of trade and craft and friendship that linked two great peoples in a way that almost never happened before or since. That's gone. Khazad-dûm is alone again, behind its locked door, with its Mithril and its memory of better times. There's a detail in what this isolation means for the city that's easy to overlook. While Awash existed and the western doors were open, Khazad-dûm had a genuine window to the wider world, to trade, to elvish knowledge, to the kind of cultural contacts that keeps a society from turning entirely inward. When those doors close, that window closes with them. Everything that comes into the city for all the remaining centuries of the Third Age comes through the Eastern Gate, in much smaller quantities and across terrain that's far less hospitable than the roads through Awash once were. The city becomes self-sufficient in a way that is both impressive and, over the long centuries, quietly narrowing. The dwarves are still excellent at what they do. They're just doing it more and more alone. With the Second Age behind them and the Third Age opening, Khazad-dûm settles into a long, relatively undocumented period of continuation. The city keeps going. The Ymaith rill veins keep being followed, deeper and deeper into the rock. The kings of Do-Rin's line rule in succession. The late Second Age and early Third Age are mostly a blank in the recorded history of Khazad-dûm, which is both frustrating and somehow fitting. The city was still there, still inhabited, still functioning. Tolkien doesn't give us details because there's no event of sufficient drama to record. No invasions, no catastrophic losses, no great alliances. Just a city going about its long business. There are kings in this period, whose names we don't know well or know only from genealogies. Do-Rin, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th all rule Khazad-dûm at various points, though the exact shape of their reigns isn't recorded. Do-Rin the 3rd is notable for receiving the Dwarven Ring from Caleb Rimbor in the Second Age. The others are largely names without individual histories attached to them. What's happening under the surface of things through this period is that the population is slowly dwindling. Tolkien mentions this without much elaboration. Dwarves have a lower birth rate than men, and the wars of the Second Age took their toll. The city is still enormous, still remarkable, but it's not as full as it once was at its peak. The halls that once rang with the sound of many thousands are somewhat quieter. The lamps still burn, but there are fewer hands tending them, and the Ymaith rill veins are going deeper. This is the thing that slowly, over centuries, becomes the central preoccupation of Khazad-dûm in the Third Age. The mithril was always the heart of the city's wealth, and as the shallower veins become exhausted, the dwarves follow the metal downward. Deeper into the deeps, deeper past the charted passages, deeper into parts of the mountain that feel different, wider spaces, stranger acoustics, less familiar stone. The 7 dwarven rings are also moving through their own quiet arc during this period, one that's easy to lose track of against the larger history. 2 are recovered by SOW Ron relatively quickly in the early Third Age. 4 others end up in dragon hordes, when dragons attack the dwarven settlements of the Grey Mountains in the north, burning the halls and scattering the inhabitants. The Ring of Do-Rin's line is the last and most significant of the 7, and it stays with the line of Khazad-dûm's kings through much of the Third Age, passed from father to son, a source of the gold hunger that makes dwarves simultaneously great miners and occasionally difficult neighbours. There's something a little melancholy about this picture of the Third Age city, if I'm honest. The greatest dwarven realm, at its most splendid, was a place of friendship and exchange and extraordinary craft. By the early Third Age, it's still magnificent, still inhabited by skilled and proud people, but it's become more isolated, more focused on a single resource, and quieter than it used to be. The mithril is down there, and the dwarves are going to follow it, as they always have. Since we're spending time in this quieter period of the city's history, it's worth understanding what was actually sleeping below those deepest mine levels. Something had been there long before the city, and long before the mountain had any of the names we've been using. Something that predated Khazad-dûm by thousands of years. The thing in the deeps beneath Khazad-dûm is called, in the dwarven tradition, after its awakening, Di-ho-rin's Bane. Its actual name isn't recorded anywhere in the texts. What we know is what it is, a Balrog. To understand what a Balrog is, you have to go back to before the world was made. In Tolkien's cosmology, the primordial spirits who participated in the great music before creation are called Ainur. The Vala are the most powerful of these, the ones who entered the world and shaped it. The Maya are a secondary order, lesser in power, but still vastly beyond mortal beings. Gandalf is a Maya. So is SOW Ron. So were the Balrogs before Morgoth corrupted them. This is the thing about Balrogs that's easy to miss. They started as beings of the same fundamental nature as Gandalf. Maya, primordial spirits, who were seduced to Morgoth's service and took on forms of fire and shadow. The Balrog that the Fellowship encounters in Moria, that vast terrible creature with the flaming sword and the whip of many thongs, began its existence as a spirit of creation. And somewhere in the early ages of the world, it chose a different path, or was drawn into one. That's what Gandalf means when he confronts the creature on the bridge and names himself a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. He's not just announcing credentials, he's speaking to a being of the same fundamental nature as himself. I am what you once were before the corruption. I serve the light that you abandoned. It's a confrontation between two ancient spirits who knew each other, in some sense, before the world began. During the First Age, Balrogs were the elite commanders of Morgoth's forces. They killed kings and heroes. They led the great assaults on elven strongholds. The most famous of them was Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, who killed 2 high kings of the Noldor. Tolkien's later conception made them rare and uniquely terrible. His notes suggest no more than 3 to 7 ever existed. A single one could devastate an army. When the War of Wrath came at the end of the First Age and the Valar's armies marched against Angband, most Balrogs were killed. A few survived by fleeing into the deep places of the earth, in inaccessible spots at the roots of mountains. The one that would become Di-ho-rin's Bane fled east, away from the destruction of Beleriand, and found the Misty Mountains. It went down, very far down, into the roots of Cu-ra-Thras, below even the deepest levels of what would become Khazad-dûm. And there it slept. For more than 5,000 years, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm built their city above it, without knowing it was there. They mined for centuries without penetrating whatever chamber it rested in. The whole extraordinary civilization of Khazad-dûm was built directly on top of a sleeping catastrophe, and for most of the city's history, neither party was aware of the other. The Gandalf parallel, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the things that makes the Moria confrontation genuinely interesting, rather than just dramatically exciting. There's a tendency to read the bridge scene as the wizard heroically facing a monster, and on the surface that's what it is. But Tolkien was doing something more specific. He was staging a confrontation between 2 fallen and unfallen versions of the same kind of being. Gandalf and the Balrog are both Maya. They are spiritual equals in nature, though not in current power or purpose. One served Morgoth and took on fire and shadow. One serves Ilúvatar and took on an old man's form, deliberately limiting himself. The battle between them is between those 2 choices, between what a Maya can become when it gives itself to corruption, and what a Maya can remain when it accepts limitation and service. That's a much more interesting conflict than hero versus monster, and it's what Tolkien was actually writing. The monster framing is just the surface of it. There's a long-running debate among Tolkien readers about whether Balrogs have wings. The text in The Fellowship of the Ring describes the Balrog as having shadow that seem to spread out like 2 vast wings, which can reasonably be read as metaphorical. Shadow spreading like wings rather than literal anatomical wings. The creature's failure to simply fly over the gap at the bridge, rather than falling through it, suggests flight wasn't on the table. I've always read it as shadow rather than actual wings, for what that's worth, but people have been arguing about it since 1955, and will probably continue to do so indefinitely, which is a very Tolkien sort of thing to still be happening. What isn't ambiguous is that when it finally wakes, after 5,000 years in the dark, it is extraordinary and terrible in a way that even the proud dwarves of Khazad-dûm can't withstand. In the year TA 1980, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm dig into something they didn't know was there. The specific circumstances of the discovery aren't described in the texts. We don't have anyone's account of what it looked like from inside. No miner's record of the tunnel breaking through into a vast chamber. No description of the first moment of realization. All Tolkien tells us from various angles is that the dwarves delved too deep in their pursuit of mithril and woke something in the dark. The word greedily appears in various accounts of this event, and I'd push back slightly on that framing. The dwarves weren't simply being reckless, they were following a vein of the most valuable metal in the world, doing exactly what miners do, following the ore wherever it leads. That the ore happened to lead them into a chamber occupied by an ancient Maya who had been sleeping for millennia is not something you can reasonably plan around. The Balrog wakes. It is not pleased about it. What happens in the immediate aftermath of the awakening isn't fully recorded, but the broad shape is clear. The Balrog emerges from the deep places, bringing destruction. Against this, the dwarves bring axes and considerable courage, both of which they have in abundance. Neither is sufficient. Durinvai, the king of Khazad-dûm, is killed, the king of Hope. He's the sixth of the Doo Rin line, and his death at the hands of the awakened creature gives it its dwarven name, Doo Rin's Bane. The loss of the king is catastrophic both practically and symbolically. He's not merely a political leader, he's the latest bearer of the most sacred name in dwarven history. His death is, in some sense, the city's death, even though the city itself doesn't fall immediately. The dwarves don't simply leave when Doo Rin VI dies, that's not how they work. Nine the First, his son, assumes the kingship and attempts to hold the city against the creature. The attempt lasts 1 year. In TA 1981, Nine the First is also killed. That's when the decision is made to flee. What that departure must have looked like. The last king walking out of the East Gate, the crystal lamps being extinguished one by one, or simply left to go out on their own, the treasury vaults being sealed or abandoned, the accumulated wealth of thousands of years being left behind, is something I find myself dwelling on. Tolkien doesn't describe it, he just notes that the dwarves fled, but the weight of what they're leaving is staggering. The tomb of Doo is in there, the records of the city, millennia of them, the craft works that took generations to complete, all of it left in the dark. The city stands empty, the Balrog settles somewhere in the deep, and Khazad-dûm becomes what the elves of Lothlorien now name it. Moria, the Black Pit, the Black Chasm. The dwarves never accept this name. Throughout all the centuries that follow, they continue to call it Khazad-dûm, or Dwaro Delph, and they speak of it as their home that was taken from them, not as something dead. There's a distinction there that matters to them. Doo Rin's folk would lose their homes more than once in the ages to come. The pattern was always the same. Hold the memory of the place, grieve it, and eventually try to get it back. What a dwarf cannot take in his hands, he carries in his head. The history of Khazad-dûm doesn't end when the dwarves leave it. It just changes form, from a living city to a memory kept in the minds of a people in exile, waiting to become a city again. Nine the First is the last king of Khazad-dûm for this era. His tomb is not in the mountain. He died fighting outside it, or in the passages near the surface. The exact location isn't specified. The tombs of the kings who came before him, Doo Rin included, remain inside the mountain in the care of the dark. After the dwarves flee in TA and 1981, Moria is silent for nearly 500 years. The Balrog has the place to itself, and Tolkien says essentially nothing about this period. That silence is part of the record. What we can say is that for those 5 centuries, a being of ancient power is sitting in the deepest part of a dead city, in the dark, with no company and no purpose. It's an odd image. The Balrog isn't building anything. It isn't tending anything. It arrived as a warrior and commander in the First Age, in Morgoth's service, and Morgoth has been gone for thousands of years. There's no master to serve, no army to lead, no war to fight. Just the stone and the dark and the occasional drip of water somewhere deep in the mountain. The empty city above it is interesting to think about. The crystal lamps which needed tending would gradually have gone out without anyone to maintain them. The light shafts cut through the rock would have continued to admit some daylight to the upper levels. The polished stone walls and the carved passages and the bridge of Khazad-dûm would have remained, because stone doesn't rot. Khazad-dûm, emptied of its inhabitants, would have been a strange and beautiful ruin, still essentially intact, just dark and quiet. All of Na'vi's craftsmanship, all of the work of thousands of years, standing, unattended, in the dark. Durin's stone is still by the Mirrormere. The endless stair is still running from the foundations to the summit of Zirac Sigil. The doors of Durin on the western face, sealed shut, with their Ithildin inscription, invisible in ordinary light, all of it waiting. Around TA 2480, the waiting ends. Sauron, who has been gathering strength in Dol Guldur in southern Mirkwood since around TA 1000, is now powerful enough to start manipulating the peoples of Middle-earth more actively. Under his influence, or simply by opportunism, orcs begin to move into Moria, occupying the upper halls and raiding the old treasuries. This cohabitation is worth thinking about carefully. The orcs establish themselves in the upper levels, the areas around the great gates, the passages near the surface. The Balrog is in the deep places, far below. And from the evidence of the texts, the orcs are simply aware that there's something terrible below them and they don't go there. The Balrog in turn doesn't seem to bother the orcs much. There's an uneasy kind of territorial arrangement at work. The top of the city for the creatures of Ron, the bottom for the ancient fire, with a great deal of empty stone between them. This arrangement matters for understanding the Fellowship's journey through Moria later. The orcs know the Balrog is down there, and they're not foolish enough to disturb it. The drums that Pippin accidentally triggers are communication and warning signals. When the Balrog eventually appears, the orcs clear out of its path. They're afraid of it. They live in its house, but they're very careful not to bother the landlord. One detail from this period that connects to the wider history. In TA 2509, about 30 years after the orcs begin occupying Moria, Celebrian, the daughter of Galadriel, wife of Elrond, mother of Elladan, Elrohir, and Arwen, is ambushed in the Redhorn Pass by orcs of the Misty Mountains. She's tormented before being rescued by her sons. She never fully recovers and eventually takes ship to Val-Inor. The connection to Moria's orc population is implied rather than explicit, but the timing and geography are suggestive. The mountain has become a danger that extends well beyond its own walls. In TA 2770, something happens that looks unrelated to Khazad-dûm, but sets in motion a chain of events that brings Durin's folk back to its door. A dragon named Smaug descends on the lonely mountain, Erebor, and drives out the dwarves who live there. This matters to our story because the Lord of Erebor at the time of Smaug's attack is Thror, who carries the last of the 7 dwarven rings, and his subsequent choices are what bring the history of Khazad-dûm back to the foreground. Thror escapes with his son Thrain, grandson Thorin, and a small number of survivors. They spend years in exile, eventually settling in Dunland in the west. And then, in TA 2790, when Thror is old and his mind is probably somewhat affected by the ring's long influence on him, He makes a decision that most people around him consider somewhere between brave and catastrophic. He decides to visit Moria. He goes alone. He takes only one companion, an old dwarf named Nar, and tells him to wait outside the east gate. Before leaving, he gives his son Thrain the last dwarven ring, which, given what happens, might have been a kind of farewell, dressed up as practical precaution. He walks into the east gate of Moria and is never seen alive again. Nar waits for days. Eventually a body is thrown from the gate, its thrall decapitated, with the name of Azog, the orc chieftain of Moria, branded on his forehead. Azog stands in the gate and tells Nar to carry the message back to whatever dwarves remain, that Moria is not for dwarves, and that any who come here will end the same way. Nar brings the news to Thrain. What follows is one of the few moments in dwarven history where the seven houses actually unite for a common purpose. Dwarves from all seven clans answer Thrain's call. Longbeards, Broadbeams, Firebeards, Ironfists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots. This has essentially never happened before. The dwarves who had been going about their separate business for centuries in distant parts of Middle-earth joined together, united by a common grievance. The War of Dwarves and Orcs runs from TA 2793 to 2799. It's fought almost entirely underground, in the tunnels and passages and mines of the Misty Mountains. The dwarves are methodical and thorough. They go from stronghold to stronghold, from Gundabad in the north to the Gladden River in the south, destroying every orc settlement they can find. Underground and in tunnels, the dwarves are very nearly unstoppable. This is their terrain. This is what they were built for. The war culminates in TA 2799 at the Battle of Azarnal Bazaar, the Dimril Dale, right outside Moria's east gate. Orcs pour out of the gate in enormous numbers, and the battle is long and terrible and costly for both sides. The dwarves are reinforced by fresh troops from the Iron Hills, led by a young dwarf named Dain Ironfoot, who fights with a red axe and remarkable ferocity. Dain kills Azog himself in the battle, which has a certain satisfying symmetry. The dwarves win, but the cost is catastrophic. So many fall that there isn't enough wood in the area to build funeral pyres in the dwarven fashion, and the dead are burned where they fell with whatever wood can be gathered. This troubles the surviving dwarves deeply. They prefer their dead to be laid in stone, but there's no choice. The mourning in Tolkien's account of the aftermath has a genuine weight to it. And then Thrain says he wants to go into Moria itself, now that the orcs are broken. Dain refuses. He had stood at the east gate and seen something waiting in the shadows within. He says it is a power of ancient evil, that no victory they can achieve with axes will avail against what waits inside. He saw Durin's bane. He wouldn't go in. The dwarves disperse. Dain and his people return to the Iron Hills. Thrain and his survivors go to the Blue Mountains. Moria remains closed. The orc power is broken for now, but the Balrog is still inside, and the most the dwarves can say is that their revenge is complete. One thing worth dwelling on about the War of Dwarves and Orcs before we leave it. It's the most successful, purely dwarven military campaign in the recorded history of Middle-earth. The seven houses, who had no particular reason to cooperate and whose interactions were generally limited to trade, came together and conducted a sustained 6-year war underground across the entire length of the Misty Mountains, and they won it comprehensively. Every orc stronghold from Gundabad to the Gladden Fields was destroyed. The orcs didn't recover significantly in the Misty Mountains for generations after. Whatever else might be said about the dwarves, and there's plenty that could be said, they were extraordinarily capable when they put their minds to fighting underground in stone. This was not a military force that could be easily dismissed. The tragedy, and it is a genuine tragedy, is that the victory didn't get them what they were fighting for. They came back from Azarnal Bazaar with the head of Azog and the knowledge that every orc between Gundabad and the Gladden River was dead or fled, and they still couldn't go into Moria. Dain Ironfoot, who had killed the orc chieftain with his own hands, and was by every measure a hero of that battle, stood at the gate and refused. He'd seen what was inside. He knew the war they'd just won was the wrong war, the war they could fight, not the war they needed to win. After the war of dwarves and orcs, the history of Moria goes quiet for a generation. But several things happen in this quiet period that connect directly to what comes next. Thrain II, carrying the last of the 7 dwarven rings, eventually leaves the Blue Mountains. He's restless, consumed by a desire to return to Erebor or Moria, or to do something about the accumulated losses of his lifetime. He sets out in TA 2841 with a small company heading east. They don't make it far enough to matter. Somewhere in the east, SOW Ron's agents capture Thrain, and he ends up a prisoner in Dol Guldur, SOW Ron's fortress in southern Mirkwood. SOW Ron takes the ring. The last of the 7 dwarven rings is gone. All 7 are now either destroyed in Dragonfire or in SOW Ron's possession. Sometime between TA 2845 and 2850, Gandalf goes to Dol Guldur to investigate the growing dark power there. He finds Thrain dying in the dungeons, imprisoned for years, the ring taken, barely able to remember who he is. But Thrain gives him something, a map of the Lonely Mountain and the key to its secret door. He asks Gandalf to pass them to his son. Gandalf does this eventually. In TA 2941, he arranges the meeting that becomes the Quest of Erebor, hands the map and key to Thorin Oakenshield, and the rest is The Hobbit. 13 dwarves, a hobbit, a dragon under a mountain. What's relevant here is that Balin is there. Balin is one of Thorin's company, the eldest after Thorin himself. White-bearded, dignified, the lookout man of the group. He's described in The Hobbit as observant and wise. He had a long friendship with Bilbo Baggins that's mentioned several times in the later books. He survives the Quest of Erebor, and he survives the Battle of 5 Armies in TA 2941, which results in Erebor being reclaimed and Smaug being dead. He settles into life at the Lonely Mountain under King Dain II Ironfoot. A note on Moria's chronology from this period. The timeline records that Gandalf enters Moria somewhere between TA 2845 and 2850, apparently looking for Thrain, who has already been captured and taken to Dol Guldur. We have no record of what Gandalf sees inside, or what he does there. He enters and comes out again. Whatever he encounters inside the mountain, and he clearly has some foreknowledge of what Durin's Bane is by the time of the Lord of the Rings, it's not recorded. That gap is rather tantalising. Gandalf goes into an orc-occupied city with a Balrog in the basement, doesn't find what he's looking for, and comes back out. What happened in there? No idea. It's just a note in the timeline. In TA 2989, Balin leaves Erebor. He's over 200 years old, which is old even by dwarven standards, and the wisdom you'd expect from someone of that age doesn't entirely prevent him from making what looks, from the outside, like a very unwise decision. He's going to reclaim Moria. Dain II gives permission, though not enthusiastically. He's the one who stood at the East Gate after the Battle of Azan-el-Biza and saw the Balrog watching from the darkness inside, and he's never forgotten it. He knows what's in there. He lets Balin go because Balin is going to go, whether or not he gives his blessing, and because there's a restlessness in the dwarves of Erebor that needs somewhere to go. With Balin go several notable dwarves. Oin, the older brother of Glóin and thus uncle to Gimli, a veteran of the Quest of Erebor. Ori, one of the younger dwarves from Thorin's company, who in his later years has apparently become a chronicler. He's the one who will write the Book of Masarbel. Floy, Fra, Lonnie and Nali, and many others unnamed. They arrive in the Dimril Dale and immediately encounter orcs. There's a battle at and around the East Gate, in which the colony comes off significantly better than the Orcs. Floy is killed during this first fight and is buried by the Mirrormere at the foot of Dio Orin's stone. That detail, the first casualty buried next to the lake that Dio Orin the Deathless himself discovered at the founding, has a particular kind of weight. The surviving dwarves take the East Gate and establish themselves inside. They settle in the 21st Hall in the northern end of the upper levels, near the Chamber of Mazabul on the 7th level. Balin proclaims himself Lord of Moria, a title slightly below king. The colony is too small to properly constitute a kingdom, but meaningful in what it claims. This is ours again. His seat is in the Chamber of Mazabul, the old records room of Khazad-dûm. He rules from the same chamber where ancient records of the city were once kept. That choice feels deliberate, a statement of continuity with what was lost. For 5 years, the colony thrives. The Orcs are reduced to a nuisance. The dwarves explore and restore, and in doing so they make extraordinary finds. Durin's axe, a great heirloom of the line of Durin, left behind when the city was abandoned 1,000 years earlier. A silver helm, possibly the crown of Durin I. Deposits of mithril still in the rock, untouched since the dwarves fled. The colony sends word back to Erebor, reporting these discoveries. Few additional dwarves come to join them. Oin, in this period of relative stability, is sent west with a party to try to reopen the Hollin Gate, the doors of Dio-Orin, on the western face of the mountain. If they can make the western entrance usable again, it gives the colony a second exit and a connection to the trade routes on the other side of the mountains. The colony is doing well. It's small, isolated, and it knows there's something dangerous in the deep places below it, though the exact nature of Dio-Orin's bane isn't known to them. The Book of Mazabul refers to the danger below without clearly naming it. They know something is down there. They've been careful to stay in the upper levels. Tom Shippey, writing about this section of the Legendarium, noted an interesting ambiguity in Balin's decision. Tolkien wrote that a shadow of quiet fell over the dwarves of Erebor before Balin's expedition, as if something was unsettling them. Shippey points out that Tolkien is deliberately unclear about whether this restlessness is simply mortal discontent or something more, whether the dwarves were subtly nudged toward Moria by some external influence, some distant working of SOW Ron. Maybe Balin went because he wanted to. Maybe something else helped him want to. Tolkien doesn't resolve it. The 5 years of success that the colony actually achieves are worth treating as genuinely remarkable, because they're easy to overshadow by what comes after. These were 5 years in which a small group of dwarves, vastly outnumbered by the Orcs in the region, held the upper levels of the greatest dwarven city in history against repeated assault, and actually made progress. They restored sections that had been dark for 1,000 years. They relit passages. They found things their ancestors had made and lost. That a man of Balin's age and distinction would choose to spend his last years attempting this, rather than in comfortable retirement at Erebor, tells you something about what Khazad-dûm meant to Durin's folk, even after a millennium of darkness. You don't make that kind of effort for a place you've given up on. You make it for a place that still, somewhere, feels like home. November 10, TA 2994. It's a specific date, and specificity matters here, because the account of what happened is partly reconstructed from a document written day by day in failing circumstances by someone who was running out of time. The Book of Mazabul, found by the Fellowship 25 years later, is the record of the colony's history kept by Ori. Its last pages are the most detailed accounts we have of how Balin's attempt ended. On that November day, Balin goes alone to look into the Mirrormere, the same lake that Durin the Deathless had looked into at the founding, thousands of years ago, the lake where Floy was buried at the start of this expedition. Whatever drew Balin there, memory or reflection, or the particular pull the Mirror seems to have on the line of D-O-O Rin, he goes alone. An orc archer shoots him from behind a stone. He dies in the Dimril Dale, 5 years after proclaiming himself Lord of Moria. The dwarves kill the archer and retrieve Balin's body. But the archer was not alone. Orcs come up the Silverlode River in force, attacking from the east in numbers the colony can't match. The surviving dwarves fall back into the mountain, bar the east gate, and try to hold. What follows is a retreat, room by room, hall by hall. The east gate falls, the first hall. The orcs push toward the bridge. At the bridge, or in the second hall near it, Fra, Lonnie and Gnarly make their stand, and fall there. 3 dwarves dying in the hall of the greatest bridge in the greatest city their people ever built. Their names preserved in Ori's chronicle because he wrote them down. The remaining survivors fall back to the chamber of Mazarbul on the 7th level. They bar the doors. They build a tomb for Balin in the chamber where he had set his seat. And Ori keeps writing. The Book of Mazarbul becomes increasingly desperate in these last pages. Oin's party, sent west to look for the Hollin Gate as a possible escape route, comes back short. Only 4 of his people return. The water level in the passage to the western gate has risen to the walls. There's something in the pool. It took Oin. The 4 survivors don't say much more than that. This is the Watcher in the water, the creature in the pool on the western face of the mountain that will later close the doors on the Fellowship and grab Frodo by the ankle. Its presence makes the western exit impossible. The colony is trapped. Ori's entries become shorter. The tone shifts from chronicle to something closer to the purely human act of bearing witness when there's nothing else to do. We cannot get out, we cannot get out. They have taken the bridge and the second hall. Fra and Lonnie and Gnarly fell there bravely, while the rest retreated to Mazarbul. We still hold, but hope undying. The last entry is fragmentary. The pool is up to the wall at Westgate. The Watcher in the water took Oin. We cannot get out. And then, in a trailing scrawl of letters, they are coming. Ori wrote that knowing it was the last thing he would write. He kept the book current until the moment he couldn't anymore. 25 years later, Gandalf picks it up in the same room where the orcs killed the last of Balin's colony and reads it aloud to a fellowship that is trying very hard not to make any noise. What moves me about Ori's chronicle every time I come back to it is the ordinariness of the record keeping in the face of what was clearly a worsening situation. The early pages are precise and almost administrative. Dates, events, resources found, decisions made. The tone shifts only in the final days when precision is maintained, yesterday being the 10th of November. But the content has become desperate. He was a chronicler doing his job until the end. They are coming is not a literary flourish. It's a data point, the last data point he had time to record. The Book of Mazarbul is also, from a literary perspective, one of the more quietly extraordinary things in the Fellowship of the Ring. Tolkien has Gandalf read from it aloud in the chamber while they're waiting to be attacked, which means the reader gets the history of the colony delivered in fragments, under time pressure, with the drums starting in the middle of the reading. The form and the situation mirror each other. Ori's chronicle was also written in fragments, under time pressure, with an attack coming. There's a rather elegant structural echo there, and the fact that it's read in the same room where it was written, by people in a nearly identical situation, trapped, doors threatened, waiting for the assault, is the kind of thing Tolkien does very deliberately. After the orcs break through and the colony is overrun, silence descends on Moria again. No word goes back to Erebor. After 25 years without news, Dain II sends Glóin and his son Gimli to Rivendell to try to get information. Frodo meets Glóin at the Council of Elrond and asks about Balin and Ori and Oin. Glóin's face darkens and he says he doesn't know. That's all he has. The Fellowship of the Ring is 9 people. 4 hobbits, 2 men, a dwarf, an elf, and a wizard. They leave Rivendell on December 25th, TA 3018, heading south with the intention of crossing the Misty Mountains by the pass of Cu-Ra-Thras. The pass of Cu-Ra-Thras fails them. The mountain itself seems to push them back. The weather is terrible beyond what any natural storm should be, and spells are spoken in the darkness that seem to worsen it. The Fellowship is forced to descend and choose a different route. The alternative is to go under the mountain through Moria, and Gandalf is not enthusiastic about it. He knows what's in there. He's been in there, or near enough. But the other routes are also dangerous, and so on January 13 they arrive at the western face of the Misty Mountains looking for the doors of Dho-Rin. Finding the doors takes some effort. They're designed to be invisible when closed, after all, and it's only when Gandalf lights his staff and holds it near the cliff that the Itilden inscription becomes visible in the moonlight. The symbols and letters glowing silver against dark stone after more than 1,000 years of invisibility. Gandalf then spends some time trying to work out the password. He tries various elvish words and phrases, working through logical combinations. The Fellowship waits by the pool. Something stirs in the water, and they edge away from it without quite knowing why. Then Frodo, reading the inscription again, Pedo Melon and Minnow, speak friend, and enter, suggests the obvious. It just means say the word for friend. Melon. The doors open. What happens next is quick. Something in the pool moves. An arm emerges. Frodo is grabbed by the ankle. It takes Aragorn's knife to free him, and then there are tentacles reaching out of the dark water, and the Fellowship is running through the open doors. The doors crash shut behind them. Stone falls across the entrance. They're inside. For 3 days and 2 nights, they make their way through Moria in the dark. The passages are vast in a way the text conveys through implication rather than description. 9 people in halls built to house tens of thousands. Gandalf gets briefly confused by branching passages he doesn't remember from his previous visit, and leads them to a room to rest while he thinks. He sits alone and smokes his pipe. After a while he knows which way to go. Then Pippin drops something into a well. A stone falls for a very long time before a small distant plink is heard. Then a rhythmic tapping begins from somewhere below. Then silence. They reach the chamber of Mazabul on January 15. In the middle of the room, a stone sarcophagus with dwarven runes. Balin, son of Fundin, lord of Moria. Gimli sees it. He covers his face with his hood. He weeps. Balin was his relative by kinship. Oin was his uncle. Ori he knew. They're all dead in here somewhere. Gandalf finds the Book of Mazabul in pieces on the floor and reads it aloud. And then before he can finish, drums start. From far below, booming through the stone. There's a fight. Orcs and a cave troll break through the northern door. Frodo is stabbed. The spear point hits the mithril coat and doesn't penetrate, though the blow is still enough to send him sprawling. The Fellowship fights its way out of the chamber and retreats for the bridge. They reach it, the bridge of Khazad-dûm, narrow over its chasm, the same bridge Durin had built for the defence of his city in the earliest age of the world. Behind them, fire is coming up the passage. Gandalf turns on the bridge and faces what's coming. He says what he says. The Balrog arrives, fire and shadow, a whip of many thongs, a sword of flame. Legolas is the first to name it. A Balrog. A Balrog is come. The bridge breaks under Gandalf's staff. The Balrog falls, and as it falls, a whip catches Gandalf's ankle, and he goes too. "Fly, you fools," he says, and is gone. The Fellowship runs for the East Gate, and out into the daylight of the Dimril Dale. Gimli, in his grief, still takes a moment to go to the Mirror and look into it. The crown of 7 stars is reflected there, unchanged. He doesn't stay long. Neither of them dies in the fall from the bridge. Tolkien's account of what happens next is given by Gandalf himself, in The Two Towers, delivered after his return. It describes a journey through places that even Khazad-dûm's builders never mapped or charted, places that are genuinely at the roots of the world. They fall for a long time, far below the levels of the city, through ancient spaces in the rock that predate the dwarves, into an underground lake. The Balrog's flame is extinguished when it hits the water. Tolkien describes it as becoming slimy and dark in the pool, which is one of those dissonant details that makes the description feel strangely real. A creature of fire put out in cold black water, the pursuit continues. Gandalf chases the Balrog for 8 days through tunnels at the roots of the mountain, places not on any dwarven map, not known to any living being. He describes being pulled down into fire and then into ice. He describes fighting in deep chambers that no light had ever reached. They go through places that exist below the world, as it's normally understood. Eventually, they reach the endless stair, the staircase that Durin built from the foundations to the summit of Ziraxagil, running the full height of the mountain. They climb it together, still fighting. The climb takes days. They emerge at the top, Durin's tower, at the peak of the Silvertine, the same tower that Durin's people built at the summit in the city's golden age. January 23, Tia 3019. The final battle begins. It lasts for 3 days and 2 nights, on the peak of a mountain, in snow and cold, far above everything. 2 Maiar who were once of the same order, one fallen and one still faithful, fighting on a stage that no mortal witness will ever see. On January 25th, the Balrog is defeated. It falls from the mountainside, its body breaking the cliff as it comes down. Durin's tower itself is destroyed in the battle. The entrance to the endless stair is blocked by debris. The staircase that Durin built thousands of years ago, that survived the abandonment of the city and 1,000 years of the Balrog's residence, is gone. Then Gandalf dies. He's completed what he came to do in this confrontation, but he is beyond what his body can sustain after 10 days of continuous supernatural combat. He lies on the peak in the snow. He doesn't stay dead. Tolkien's theology here is specific. When Gandalf's body dies, a decision is made at a higher level, by the Valar, or perhaps directly by Ilúvatar, to send him back with greater power because his task isn't finished. He returns as Gandalf the White. He's carried from the mountain by the eagle Gwaihir on February 17, brought to Lothlorien and healed. The significance of this encounter for the larger story is sometimes underappreciated. Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White are not the same person in the same way. The White is more direct, more capable of confronting Shruman on equal terms, more willing to use power openly. The death and transformation on Ziraxagil is not incidental to the narrative. The encounter with Durin's Bane is what makes the rest of the war winnable. For Khazad-dûm itself, the thing that has been there since before the city was built, sleeping in the deep roots for thousands of years, woken in TA 1980, occupying the darkness for another 1,000 years after the fall, it's gone. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the deepest places of the mountain are empty of the power that made reclamation impossible. The orcs are still there for now, but they're manageable. They're creatures of circumstance rather than ancient Maiar. The fundamental obstacle, the one Dain saw at the gate at Azanul-Basar and refused to face, is finally gone. After everything, the mountain is clear. One thing that connects to a broader pattern here, Gandalf's account of the pursuit through the roots of the mountain is one of the very few windows we ever get into what exists below the charted world. The dwarves knew there were spaces they hadn't mapped. Gandalf confirms it. The deep places of Arda in Tolkien's mythology are not just empty rock. There are things in those depths that predate the coming of the speaking peoples, spaces shaped by the original catastrophes of the First Age. Durin's Bane had been in one of those places, What else might be in others is left entirely open. The War of the Ring ends with the destruction of the One Ring on March 25, Tia 3019. Sauron is unmade. His armies collapse. The long shadow over Middle-earth begins, slowly, to lift. The orcs of the Misty Mountains, deprived of their master's animating malice, fall into disarray. They don't simply vanish overnight. Orcs are persistent, as Tolkien noted, but they're reduced and scattered in the aftermath. Moria is still occupied, but differently. The thing that made the occupation essentially permanent, the presence of Durin's bane, is gone. What remains are creatures that, while dangerous, are not beyond dwarven resistance. Gimli, who fought through the War of the Ring, doesn't return to Moria. He makes a different choice. He settles in the glittering caves of Aglarond, behind Helm's Deep in Rohan. He discovered these caves during the Battle of the Hornburg, and was so astonished by them. Vast crystal caverns the men of Rohan had used as a refuge, but never properly explored, that he couldn't leave them. He becomes the first lord of the glittering caves, and a new dwarven tradition begins in the west. A dwarf choosing a new underground home, rather than reclaiming an old one. There's something quietly hopeful about that. Dain Ironfoot died at the Battle of Dale during the War of the Ring. Fighting on the same day, Sauron fell. His son Thorin III Stonehelm becomes king under the mountain. The line of Durin continues, and somewhere after the year FA 171, Durin VII is born into that line. He's a descendant of Dain Ironfoot, and the dwarves believe him to be the seventh and final return of Durin the Deathless, the last time the founder's spirit comes back to inhabit a body that resembles him. Tolkien's note in The Peoples of Middle-earth is brief. Durin VII led Durin's folk back to Khazad-dûm and reclaimed it. The return must have been, in its way, one of the significant events of the Fourth Age, even if the records we have don't give it much space. The dwarves coming back through the East Gate, past the Mirrormere, past Durin's stone, still standing, still weather-worn, into halls that had been abandoned and then occupied and then finally emptied again. That would have been a moment of enormous weight for the people who made it. The city they found would have been different from any version of it that any living dwarf had known. The upper levels, which Balin's colony had partially restored, would have been lived in again, but then abandoned again. The chamber of Mazabul would have had Balin's tomb still in it, and possibly some remnant of the Book of Mazabul. The endless stair destroyed in the battle on Zirak-Sigil would have needed either rebuilding or leaving as it was. The crystal lamps, long since gone out, would need new mechanisms or replacement. Returning to Khazad-dûm in the Fourth Age wasn't just a matter of walking back in. It was starting again, in a space that was both deeply familiar and shaped by everything that had happened to it since the dwarves left 1,000 years before. The final word on Khazad-dûm in Tolkien's published writing is this passage from Appendix A. It is said that the House of Durin reclaimed their inheritance, and until the day when the race of the dwarves itself should end, their hammers would ring in the great halls beneath the misty mountains. The hammers ring again, the crystal lamps are relit, the dwarves come home to the city that Durin the Deathless founded before the First Age, the city they lost to a Balrog, that stood in darkness for 1,000 years, that resisted every attempt at reclamation, and then finally, at last, accepted them back. Balin's tomb is still in the chamber of Mazabul. The inscription on Durin's stone at the Mirrormere has become even more weather-worn over the centuries. But the Mirrormere itself still shows the crown of 7 stars that Durin saw when he first arrived here, thousands of years ago. The lake doesn't change. Some things in this world last, and that's the history of Khazad-dûm. All of it, from the moment Aula made the 7 fathers in secret in a hall under the mountains, to Durin waking alone at Gundabad and walking south, to the building of the city and the golden centuries of the early Second Age, to the friendship with Ehreg Eon and the making of the doors of Durin, to the closing of those doors when Essoron destroyed Areg Eon, to the long deepening of the mine works through the Third Age, to the Balrog waking in Tia 1980 and the fall of the city, to Balin's colony and Ori's chronicle, and the last words written in the chamber of Mazabul, to the fellowship in January, TA 3019 and GA Endalf on the peak of Siraxigil, and finally, somewhere in the Fourth Age, the hammers ringing again in the great halls. It's a very long history for a single location, longer in some ways than most of the great arcs of the mythology. The elves have their age of glory in Beleriand and their long decline. Men rise and fall and rise again, but Khazad-dûm is just there through all of it, being what it is, a hole in a mountain, full of extraordinary things, made by people who loved craft and stone and the deep places of the world. The thing that stays with me, coming to the end of this history, is the resilience of it. Not the resilience of the stone. Stone doesn't have a choice about enduring, but the resilience of the people, and the idea. Durin's folk lose their greatest city, and they grieve it, and they keep it in memory across 1,000 years. They try to reclaim it 3 times. Thror's lone walk, Balin's colony, and eventually Durin's 7 successful return. 2 of those attempts end badly, but they keep trying because it's theirs, because Durin built it, and his name keeps coming back to remember it. There's something in that persistence that Tolkien seems to find genuinely admirable without sentimentalizing it. The dwarves aren't the most glamorous people in the mythology. They're not elves with their tragic grandeur. They're not men with their complicated heroism. They're shorter and stubborner and more focused on immediate material things. But they build the greatest city in the world, underground, in the dark, and they come back to it no matter how many times they're driven away. There's a dignity in that. The Mirror still shows the 7 stars that Durin saw when he first arrived. That's the image I keep returning to. Everything changes. The city grows and falls. The Balrog sleeps and wakes and is killed. An age of the world ends. A new one begins. And the lake at the foot of the mountain still reflects a crown of stars that isn't in the sky above it, as if the founding moment is preserved in the water permanently, a record of where it all began. One of the things I find most characteristic of Tolkien's mythology, looking at a history this long, is the way he treats continuity as itself a kind of meaning. The city doesn't keep going because Tolkien wants a happy ending. It keeps going because he genuinely believed that old things have a kind of weight and a kind of resistance to being extinguished that matters. The elvish rings preserve and beautify, but they also, in a sense, arrest. The dwarves don't preserve, they rebuild. Every time they come back to Khazad-dûm, they're not trying to freeze it in the form it was. They're trying to inhabit it again, to make it a living place again. And that means accepting everything that happened to it and starting from where things actually are. There's something quietly wise about that. I also think Tolkien genuinely liked dwarves, more than he sometimes let on in interviews where he called them an addition rather than an integral part of his mythology. The love of craft, the stubbornness, the attachment to specific places and specific histories, the way they carry grief without being consumed by it. These feel like qualities he valued, perhaps recognised. Khazad-dûm is their monument, and it's one of the most fully realised locations in the whole of the Legendarium. I hope that was a comfortable few hours. If you drifted off somewhere around the Second Age, that's as it should be. The history kept going without you, and it'll be there if you come back to it. There are more of these long lore videos on the channel, and I've got plans for more.